Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about the curves tool, which is one of the most powerful tools for taking control of the tones within your image. It's also really useful for controlling color, and I'll be discussing that second aspect in either a second or a third video. So this is going to be a 2 or 3 part series. But the curves tool exists in a whole host of editing packages, in photo packages and in video editing packages. So you can find it almost anywhere, and understanding it is incredibly useful. There are some subtle differences between exactly how the curve is applied, but if you understand the underlying principles, then hopefully you can take control of it in whatever software package you're using. So I'm going to be talking about it in Photoshop just because it's a little bit easier to describe, and that's also where I use the curves tool in my own workflow. So quite often I will do the majority of my edits in Lightroom and then do the final finessed edits using curves adjustments in Photoshop. Occasionally I'll stack 10 layers of curves adjustments, each affecting a local area in a very specific way. So it is a very useful tool to me, but it is achieving just that very last 5%. And if you're a beginner or intermediate, then you may be wasting your time watching this video because you're going into specifics and technicalities that you just don't need at this stage, and you're much better watching a video that I produced a week ago showing you how to edit your images exclusively in Lightroom. But if you are interested in how the curves tool works, if you do want to achieve that last 5%, if you've got to that finessed editing stage, then hopefully you'll find this video interesting. So let's get started. So here we are in Photoshop editing this photo from the highlands of Iceland, taken on a backpacking workshop a couple of years ago. So of course we want to create a curves adjustment, and the best way to do that is to create a new adjustment layer, which we can do by selecting layer and then new adjustment layer, and you can see curves there. But by far the fastest way is to come into the layers palette, and you can see this half moon icon at the bottom. If you click that, it brings up all of the potential adjustment layers, and we're going to select curves, at which point the properties palette will load up and you can see the curves tool there. But importantly, we've created a new layer on top of whichever layer we had selected. So this actually gives us a lot of control in our layers palette itself, because we can use this layer mask here if you want to apply the effect locally. We can use the blend modes if we want to apply the curves adjustment in a specific way. The luminosity blend mode, for example, is very useful if you don't want the curves adjustment to affect the colors in your image. And then finally, we've got the opacity adjustment, so you can just change the extent to which that adjustment is applied, which I actually use really regularly because it's just a really quick way of reducing the effect of any curves adjustment. But of course, what we want to do is actually discuss what this curve actually does. Most people get an understanding of the curves tool by just pushing this line around, and actually most videos on YouTube explain it in these terms because of course it's quite simple to understand that if you push the line up, things get brighter, and if you push the line down, things get darker. And of course, if you create this S curve shape that we see here, so there's this sort of S, then that adds contrast. And of course, people get in and they refine these points and push them around a little bit to achieve the specific effect that they want. And that's about as far as the understanding goes. But actually, if you put the time into watching this slightly boring video, then hopefully you'll have a much better understanding of exactly what's happening here, which is really helpful because then you can use the curves tool to take full tonal control of your image, and it can essentially replace any other tonal control. In fact, I even use it for dodging and burning. So let's get into the detail a bit more. And I'll start by saying that what we're seeing here is the RGB curve. So there's actually different curves for each color channel. So there's red, green, and of course blue. And you can edit those independently, but we're not going to get into that in this video. We're going to focus on this RGB curve. And you should see a shape there that looks vaguely familiar. That's the image histogram. Specifically, it's the RGB histogram, which if I go into my histogram palette here, I can show you the difference between the RGB and luminosity histograms. They are subtly different, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to assume that they're the same because it's quite frankly close enough. And the histogram, for those of you that don't know what it is, I'm going to very quickly explain. If you imagine the image being desaturated so that it has no color, it's just shades of gray, black and white, then the histogram is a graph of the proportion of pixels of that particular tone. So pure black is on the far left and pure white is on the far right, and you have every shade of grey in between. And we can look at a particular area of brightness in the image. So let's take this near black area of sand, and you can say, okay, well, that's close to black, so that's going to be this area of the histogram. Similarly for the highlights, maybe this bright area in the sky and the reflection in the water, they look like the brightest areas of the image. So that must be this area of the histogram. And then we've got our midtones, which is quite often where the most intense colours are. So that's the azure water here and the moss on the opposite hillside. And then finally, we've got quite a large area of dark midtones. So they're further left than mid-grey, which would be this line here. So we can relate that to all of the grey sand here in the foreground and the hillside opposite, maybe this top left corner where we've got a bit of vignetting and light fall off. So you can look at this graph and basically plant all the various tones in the image in relation to that histogram. So it's a really handy thing to understand as a first step. So finally, let's get on and actually explain what this curve does. So the curve does one very simple thing, and that's convert input tones into output tones. And it's basically a graph that controls how that happens, specifically through this line. So along the x-axis here, we have the input tones, and along the y-axis, the vertical axis, we have the output tones. And depending on the positioning of this line, that controls the conversion of input tone into output tone. And you can actually look at this in quite a detailed way, because we can take the mid-grey here and we can read up to our line and we can read across, and you see that it becomes a much brighter grey. In fact, it's 2 squares brighter, if you like. So let's call that 40% brighter than mid-grey was in our input tone. So pushing the line up, you can see actually every single tone has got brighter. So if we read a highlight here, we're 2 squares away from white, and if we read up to this point, you can see we're just 1 square away from white. So the highlights have got, say, twice as bright. And with the shadows, let's take 2 squares away from black. We're now 3 squares away from black. So we're actually 50% brighter in the case of these darker tones. So you can actually follow that same process for whatever curve shape you put in here. I mean, you can do something really wacky, and we'll go into why you would obviously never do something like this in a second. But you can always just say, okay, well, here's my shadow areas. Well, they're all getting brighter, whereas my midtones are getting darker because they're below this diagonal line. And my highlights are then also getting brighter. So actually recognizing this diagonal line can be very helpful. So you can just make out the shadow of that original 45-degree curve, if you like. And that point there is the point at which no tones change. So for example, if I put this point on the line here and then just click a number of points that are exactly on that line, I might miss them slightly, but for the sake of argument, let's say they're all perfectly on that line, then I can just drag down the line in this darker shadows area. And if we look at the shadows, you can see if I read up, then the shadows have become, I don't know, 20–30% darker, something like that. But none of the other tones in the image have changed at all. So if I turn the visibility of this layer on and off, then you see that the only things that are actually changing in any meaningful way are the sand in the foreground, this dark area on the opposite bank, and our vignette in the corner there. So we've specifically targeted a particular range of tones for change. It is actually a fairly large area that's being affected, but there's only a fairly tight area that's being affected significantly, whereas all of the highlight area is completely unchanged. So you can see, for example, the sky doesn't change in brightness at all. So I would suggest creating a curve yourself and having a play around with it, putting some points on the curve and then thinking, well, exactly what is going on here. For example, this adjustment, you can see that most of the line exists along that 45-degree line, so nothing is happening for the majority of tones. But in this highlights area, you can see that I'm making the highlights brighter. So if I turn that adjustment on and off, you can see just the highlights are being affected. So it's that specific understanding of exactly how to read the input and output tones that I think is really helpful, because then you will develop a very intuitive understanding of exactly what's happening. And of course, you get that sense that if you push any area above the 45-degree line here, then it will get brighter in that area of tones. A concept that's really useful to understand when it comes to curves is the understanding that the steepness of the curve relates to contrast. So it's actually an analogy for contrast, and the steeper the curve, the more contrasted that section of the histogram will be. So here we've got that classic S-curve shape. So what we've done here is we've brightened the highlights. You can see they are all above that 45-degree line, and we've darkened the shadows. And of course, if you want to know the specifics, you can read up and across to figure out exactly what's going on. In the center where the line crosses at more or less mid-gray, that's where the tone hasn't changed at all, by the way. So if the line ever intersects that diagonal line, you know the tone hasn't changed in that area. But you can see in this mid-tone area, the line is much steeper, and that's actually where we've added contrast. We've added contrast to the mid-tones. But there's no such thing as a free lunch when it comes to contrast, because unfortunately what you've actually also done is reduce the contrast of the highlights and of the shadows. And we can actually see that if we turn this adjustment on and off. So if you look at this water texture here and the texture in the clouds, then you'll see that if I turn that adjustment off, the actual tonal contrast is much better without the adjustment than with it. And similarly for the dark tones in the sand here, and particularly in this near black area, if I turn that adjustment on and off, then you can see much better shadow detail before the adjustment than after it. So when you're adding contrast, you always have to be aware that you will effectively be losing contrast elsewhere in the image, because effectively what's happening here is that what was a bright mid-tone has now become quite a bright highlight because of this adjustment. So anything that's now between a bright mid-tone and white is smushed into a tighter tonal range, so it's harder to differentiate them apart. So that's why you're losing contrast in the highlights. And of course, the reverse is true for the shadows. Now, that idea of the steepness of the line is a useful thing to take hold of, not just because you can understand where contrast is applied to the image, but also where you'd be losing contrast. And that's why a reverse S-curve doing something like this is always going to look bad, because you're reducing contrast in your midtones, and contrast actually affects saturation, so you lose saturation too. So the image just looks pretty terrible in every sense of the word, and you really want to avoid any kind of global adjustment that might bring about a change like this. And you can take that with your localized adjustments as well. So if we wanted to target a particular tonal area, for example, the bright midtones here, say we wanted to brighten those, well, we can do kind of what I'd done before and put these lines along the curve here. And if you push this line up, then of course you are brightening those bright midtones, but you can see our colors start to fall apart, and there's a weird flatness in the sky here too. And you just never want to create this kind of leveling of the curve anywhere in the midtones of the image. Now, if it happens close to white and close to black, then you can kind of get away with it, because even if the image is over contrasted, at least it doesn't look terrible. So these highlights might be too bright and lacking in detail, but it doesn't look visibly wrong. And similarly for the blacks, I mean, they look too black, but they don't look terrible. So this is kind of the one exception where you can get away with flattening the curve on a global level, is when the flattening is happening to the near whites or near blacks. So when you're adding contrast with one of these S-curves. So you don't need to be terrified of doing that, but understanding that the flattening of the curve can be a problem is really useful when you're applying these adjustments. In the second part of this video, I'm going to show you how you can use the curves tool to replace other tonal controls in Photoshop, and the same logic will extend to almost any other editing package. But just before I do that, I'm going to give you a practical way of changing the tones in Photoshop if you're not entirely comfortable with trying to spot where specific tones in the image might lie on the histogram. And that's using this finger icon to the left-hand side of the palette here. So if I click on that, then as I move around the image with this eyedropper, you'll see that circle appearing on the curve, showing exactly where that specific tone lies. So let's try and do a targeted adjustment here. So let's say what I want to do is brighten this sediment flowing into the lake here to bring out the structure a bit more, but keep the tone of the water here exactly the same. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on the water, and you can see it places points on the line there, and I'm just going to make sure that we have a couple so that all the various tones captured in the water remain unchanged, because we only want to affect this brighter area of water. And then if I click on this area and hold down, you see that finger icon appear, and if I push up, then that area will become brighter. And as it does, it actually adds some contrast between the brighter tones in the water and the darker tones, so you can see that steeper curve there, and so there's actually a bit more saturation too. But you can see if I turn that adjustment on and off that we've brightened the sediment, but we haven't brightened the surrounding water. So you can use that finger icon to target tones in a much more specific way. But when you do that, do remember about that flattening of the curve, because if you target tones too specifically, then you can start to see that problem creeping in. Now I'm going to talk about a few of the adjustments that the curves adjustment will replace. So if we click on our new adjustment layer icon down here in the layers palette again, then we can see all of the adjustments available to us. And actually they're conveniently grouped. So this group of 4 here is the tonal adjustments, and these are all color adjustments. So the ones we're looking to replace all lie within these 4. Of course, the curves is the adjustment that we're already using. We're not going to talk about exposure, because you should really be changing exposure in your raw converter where you have access to all of the tonal information in the file, but you can actually replace the effects of this slider just using the curves tool if you really wanted to, but that's not really a particularly useful tool in my opinion anyway. But we're going to start by discussing this levels tool. And levels is a tool that if you started image editing a long time ago, you probably will have been introduced to very early on. But with the increasing power of raw converters, I think this levels tool gets used less and less. But just to show you that you can fully replace what's going on here, you basically have 3 sliders, and they actually do a similar thing to the controls that we have in the curves tool. So this right hand slider is the white point slider, and if we hold down the Alt key as I drag this to the left, then you can see clipping as it starts to occur. So this is telling us that we are clipping the blue channel, so it's being maxed out at 256 if you're in an 8-bit image. And that is a useful thing to be able to do, to be able to set the white point. I'd set it just before it starts to clip, so I'd set it somewhere there. And setting the white points and black points are a fundamental part of my image editing process, and I'm going to discuss that in a completely separate video. But it's generally useful for the vast majority of daylight images shot in normal conditions to set white points and black points. So here I'm dragging the black slider off to the right whilst holding down the Alt key, and you can see that clipping starting to happen down in these darkest tones in that bottom right hand corner. So that's setting the black point. You don't set white and black points when you're shooting misty images, for example, but for the majority of scenes you would, and that's an incredibly useful thing to do. And that's what a lot of people would use the levels tool for, and maybe you'd move this central slider around to affect the brightness. But I'll just show you how that's done with the curves tool, because I use the curves tool to set white and black points, and it works exactly the same. You just drag these points to the left and right. So the white point to the left, it works exactly the same way, holding down the Alt key, and you can see the clipping start to occur, and you stop just before the clipping occurs. And similarly with that black point, so just dragging in from the left to the right, until that clipping occurs. And that's setting the white and black point using the curves tool. Very useful technique that I do on almost all of my images, and I do it locally as well, and I'll discuss that in that additional video. But that's very simple to understand, hopefully, because those two sliders are directly analogous to the level sliders. And if you want to replace that middle slider, well, that's just a matter of pushing the line up or down, just like we'd done before. So that's how that works. Very easy to replace the levels tool with the curves adjustment. The other major tonal control we have available to us is the brightness and contrast adjustment, which brings up these two very easy to use sliders, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with using these. So the brightness slider obviously brightens and darkens the image, and the contrast slider adds contrast and removes contrast. So they do a perfectly good job, and there's nothing wrong with using them, but you can achieve exactly the same effect using the curves adjustment. So in the background, I've actually created a load of adjustments and masks so that I can show you how each of these tools is replicated without taking up too much of your time. So firstly, there's the brightness plus 50 adjustment. I've used a mask, which I'm not going to explain here, to apply the effect only to the left-hand side of the image here. So if I click on that adjustment, you can see it's just a brightness plus 50 adjustment. And then I've actually replicated that using a curves adjustment. So here is the curves adjustment. This is masked to the opposite side of the image. You can see I've not done an absolutely perfect job, but it's pretty close enough, I think, that we can say that they do the same thing. The one thing I did notice is that that brightness slider actually maintains a bit more saturation. So you can see in the water here, it's a bit greener using the brightness adjustment than if you made the same tonal change with the curves adjustment. But if you did want to add that color back in, you can just use a hue saturation adjustment to do that. So the reverse is also true. You can replicate the darkening adjustment with that same slider using the same approach. So what about contrast? Well, I've done a plus 50 contrast adjustment here. So here is that adjustment. You can see the slider is now on plus 50. And we can replicate that very easily using an S-curve in the curves dialog box. So this is exactly the same. I've applied the adjustment to that right-hand side of the image this time, and that's the curves adjustment that perfectly replicates that contrast plus 50, and it's almost impossible to see the seam. So you can almost perfectly match the two in that particular case. So hopefully you can see that the curves tool there does a very good job of replicating all of the other tonal controls, but importantly you have far more control. So in the case of our contrast adjustment here, perhaps we liked what was happening to the highlights but felt that the shadows were getting too dark. Well, we can just adjust the shadows, or maybe we want to make the close to black shadows completely black or almost black, and we can use the slider to do that, and we can even add in a black point. Which brings me to the final part of the video, which is how I would actually edit this image using that curves adjustment. So let's clear all this and start afresh. So everything's now been deleted and we're back to our base image, and I'm going to create that new curves adjustment layer. And my first step is always to set white points and black points, and that doesn't suit every single image. If you've got atmospheric haze or mist or anything like that in particular, then black points or even white points can look pretty bad. But for a lot of my images, this is my first step. So I click on the white slider, hold down the Alt key and move it off to the left until clipping starts to occur. And then I just dial it back until that disappears. And I might even locally mask out that bright area of sky there. But that's something for another video. I don't want to get into masking now. And similarly for the black point, I hold down Alt and drag that off to the right as I showed earlier. And if we have a slightly larger area in that bottom right hand side starting to clip, that's a lot less of a problem with the blacks, because having a few blacks in the image isn't necessarily a problem. So now I can go in and add additional points if I want to in the curve here, so I can start adding contrast and so on. But I actually wouldn't do that at this stage. I would just create a new curves adjustment layer and apply the change there. So now we've got an updated histogram. It's stretched out between the black and white points, which is what setting those black and white points effectively does, which is why it looks slightly fragmented like that. And then I can apply any adjustments that I want to here. Well, one thing I might want to do is keep the shadows where they are, but just very fractionally darken down the midtones just to get a bit more mood into the image. So you can see it just makes it very slightly darker. And let's put another point actually on around mid-gray, and then try and hold the highlights roughly where they are, maybe very fractionally brighten them. So this is a very specific contrast adjustment because effectively I'm darkening the midtones and I'm actually protecting the darkest shadows, so I'm not darkening these areas of darkest sand there. And similarly, I'm protecting the highlights, so the highlights themselves aren't getting any brighter. So if I turn that curves adjustment on and off, then you can see the very finessed control I have using the curves adjustment. And I think that's added a nice amount of drama to the image without creating any problem areas from over contrasting, because if you'd used just a traditional S-curve, you would have made those blacks too dark and those highlights too bright. So that's actually where I'm going to stop with this video, because that's as far as I would go with global adjustments for this image. In the next video, I'm probably going to go into masking, combining masking with these curves adjustments, because you can actually use curves for dodging and burning. So I think that's what that video is going to be about, because it's an incredibly powerful combination of tools using curves and masks together. But hopefully you found this video interesting, and please do go in and really understand exactly what's going on with this curves tool, because I do think it's incredibly useful. I use it with almost all of my images to achieve that last 5%, as I said at the start of the video. And if you do have any questions, please ask away in that comments box. I try to answer all of them. And of course, please do subscribe if you'd like to see more of these videos in the future.